Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, December 28th, 2021. Great to be back from vacation. I'm really excited to redo this broadcast this evening because I've been finding more and more people come to Evoke either because they have a child at Evoke or through our intensive program who are dealing with issues of intimacy and betrayal. And what I'm hearing is a lot of the same kind of rhetoric that's out there that's talking about kind of the stages or the steps that couples need to go through to be able to repair this issue. And what I want to do tonight is really start at the heart and at the beginning. Betrayal is something that often stems or has its roots in the courtship in the beginning. It is this moment of departure from the intimacy and the commitment of marriage that I think if we look closely, we can find roots in the beginning of the marriage. I say this all the time with couples as they're considering a breakup or a divorce. Doesn't matter if it's betrayal or for some other reason, that if we look close enough, we can see the fissures, the cracks in the foundation that were there present at the beginning of the relationship. And because we're so in love and we're so intoxicated with the experience of being in love early in our relationships, we don't seek out therapy, right? It's such an overwhelming, powerful, intoxicating experience for individuals that find themselves in love. So we'll go through it as best we can. This is something I wrote in the Audacity to Be You. Because children are required to navigate their parents' defenses to survive childhood, they develop in such a way that they end up relating to people who are the same shape, size, and color of their parents. In other words, we become shaped by a certain kind of compromised person. And as we grow up, we are inclined to relate to those same kinds of people. This is the main point. The shape of our wounds predisposes us to fit with others who mirror, in some ways, our original contexts. The work then is to come to know this by unraveling our childhoods, good, bad, and in between, so that we make friends with ourselves. And if we are lucky, we find a partner who is willing to travel a similar path that is their own. Everybody experiences dents from childhood. Everybody doesn't have all of their needs completed in childhood because it's such an unconscious process, right? All of those experiences are buried in the unconscious. We aren't aware of the power and influence they have in our daily decisions, either as parents or in our intimate partner relationships. And so tonight, what I want to do is explore the landscape, explore the anatomy, if you will, of a relationship that is healthy and a relationship that is unhealthy. Years ago, actually, in a business context, I went to couples therapy. And in the couples therapy session, the first thing that the therapist started off with was asking us what we thought the responsibility was in our partnership. He had been a marriage therapist as well as a business consultant, and this is his way of getting us into the work. So he asked the question, what is the responsibility for the individual in the marriage? And each of us, being trained therapists, had somewhat articulate ideas about the responsibility of a partner. And after he listened to all of our ideas, he asked this rhetorical question. What if the answer to that question was to enjoy your partner? And if that's the answer to the question, that's your responsibility in marriage, then the follow-up question is, how are we doing? What I have come to realize as a flawed person, a flawed human being, married to a flawed human being, that at some level, after the rapture of courtship and falling in love dissipates, at some point we have to learn to fall in love with our partner's dilemma. And being a trained therapist, in fact, being married to a trained therapist, what can be a distraction or a temptation is to poke at or to point out our partner's flaws, our partner's pathology, our partner's limitations, our partner's wounds, really, and how they're expressed in a relationship. And I say this all the time. Any first-year graduate student in psychology can point out somebody else's flaws. It doesn't take a lot of talent or intelligence or even clinical expertise, right? We learn that relatively quickly. We're able to see that in other people. But what we can do, if we decide to, is we can change the project from fixing them, from looking at the partner as the problem and the solution, and we can begin to understand that it's how we're living our own lives that are the problem or the cause of our unhappiness, and therefore the solution to our happiness. I read this article some time ago. In fact, just prior to previously presenting this broadcast, uh, the name of the article in the New York Times was "Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person." For those of you watching, you can look at the link that I provided here if you want to look it up. And something they said really struck me, really hit me in the context of the kind of work that I'm going to be talking about this evening. They explained that compatibility is an achievement of love, and it must not be its precondition. Work, intimacy, if you are to live a full and a rich and a meaningful life, is difficult. Sure, you can just kind of settle into a pattern of cohabitation, and a lot of people choose to do that. Or if you're on the pathway that the clients that we work with at Evoke, both our intensives and our wilderness program, the kinds of folks that we work with, if you're on a path toward enlightenment and awareness and healing, it's going to be a difficult and painful process for both of you. And the relationship, the most primary relationships, expose in us everything that has been left undone. We do it with our children, right? Our childhood wounds show up in our parenting, and we do it in our intimate partnerships. And the work that it takes, the work past that initial rapture, is the work in our marriage, is the work in our long-term intimate relationships. I love this quote from Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which I'm sure many of you have heard, but it's worth revisiting because there's so much richness and even clinical expertise in this beautiful paragraph of prose. It goes like this: love is a temporary madness. It erupts like an earthquake and then subsides. And when it subsides, you have to make a decision. You have to work out whether your roots have become so entwined together that it is inconceivable that you should ever part. Because this is what love is. Love is not breathlessness. It is not excitement. It is not the promulgation of promises of eternal passion. That is just being in love, which any of us can convince ourselves we are. Love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had that. We had roots that grew towards each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found that we were one tree and not two. I think it's beautiful poetry, but it also speaks to, I think, an important aspect, which is that initial rush that we experience when we are newly in love is really, in a way, the echoing of our past wounds, and how temporarily they have become resolved in the context of this madness that we call falling in love. More about that. And a chapter in the Audacity to Be You, I begin it like this, with the quote, "You complete me. He is my everything. She is my world. He is my best friend, my lover, and my biggest supporter. She is my better half." While all of the above might sound wonderful and may express, in a poetic sense, a symbolic sense, the powerful nature of romantic love, these statements can also reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be in a healthy, mature, and intimate relationship. The idea of two becoming one in a psychological sense might be the seed of the later problems in marriage. Essentially, the premise is tonight that when we have this initial phase of falling in love and we experience a loss of appetite, right? Even a loss of need to sleep, our basic bodily functions seem to require no input or energy because love feeds us so completely, or what we're calling falling in love. And really what it is a temporary repairing of the childhood wound, of the thing that we didn't get from our parents. Very typically, when we get seen by our partner and adored by our partner in early courtship, we have temporarily solve the equation of getting the attention from our parents that we so desperately needed, that because of their own human limitations, they were incapable of fully giving to us everything that was required. So we experience that adoration and we call it falling in love. And really, it is a kind of a loss of self, kind of a psychosis, a merging of two, of one person filling up another. And how this is described in culture, in popular culture, is this idea that one can make somebody else happy. I'd always assumed that the job of a husband or the job of a wife was in large part to make my wife happy. So when I did during courtship and she looked at me with those beautiful large brown eyes, I called the person that I found in her eyes, the version of myself that I found in her eyes, I called that falling in love. And she referred to my ability to soothe her and to make her feel safe, which was something she didn't fully experience in childhood. She called that love. So I gave to her what her parents couldn't fully, which was a sense of safety, a sense of welcoming, and she gave to me what my parents couldn't, which was a sense that I was interesting, compelling, worthwhile, and valuable. And we call that kind of temporary repair falling in love. So what happens? We grow up, all of us, we grow up with human parents. In psychological terms, in the literature, we have this experience where a mother or a father doesn't meet our needs, where they become angry or disappointed or upset with us, and we see them as the bad object, the problem. Right? We're born into this world with the idea, and it gets reinforced by the culture, that the problem is out there. That my mother's disapproving face, my father's angry, disapproving eyes are evidence that something's wrong, that something's not well with me. And what I'm looking for is that good mother, that good father, that good parent. So we try to find somebody who can reflect back, who can look at us with those loving, wanting, desiring eyes, those attentive eyes. And like I said, we find them in our partner, and we call that falling in love. A lot of tonight's broadcast is taken from a book by James Hollis called The Eden Project, The Search for the Magical Other. And in that book, he says more often, the pathology of the parent-child relationship is calling the shots. Who in their right mind would seek out someone and say, I want you to repeat my childhood wounding. I will love you because you are so familiar. Right? Hollis is really cutting through all the crap, all the communication skills, all the pop psychology around love language and all of that stuff. And he's saying, really, this is what's at play. A fracture or a sliver of a human being coming into a relationship, asking for somebody else to complete them. And then Alice Miller goes on to say, when that doesn't work, we have children to give us the unconditional love and sense of being okay. So we're constantly looking to solve the equation. I can't overstate this next idea. I was just talking to my daughter's boyfriend about this the other night. We were sharing similar childhood wounds from our fathers. He from his father, me from mine. And as he was describing it, he was describing that the experience, the grief, the loss, the trauma from his relationship with his father, it's not very raw. He's talked about it in the therapy. He's talked about it quite a bit, and it doesn't overtake him. He doesn't become dysregulated and upset when he thinks about it. And I can relate to that. You know, the last time I became really emotional about my father wound was in my early 20s. And I've talked about it in therapy a lot. So as he's describing and we're sharing back and forth about our father wounds, he says, so I think I have that under control. I think I've worked on that issue. And I playfully said to him, me too. The only thing that is still affected by my father's absence, by my father's lack of attention, is my entire personality structure, and every relationship that I'm in kind of exposes that father wound. I'm constantly seeking, because of his abandonment, to prove to the world that I have something interesting, something worthwhile and valuable to offer. And while that might sound extraordinary, and in fact, I think it does, I see that more and more and more. See, enlightenment in this process, in marriage therapy and parenting therapy and individual therapy, it's not really, you guys, about getting better. It's about being seen by somebody in such a way, ideally a therapist or a sponsor, not a partner necessarily, although they can add to this piece somewhat, but relying on somebody whose job it is to see us that way, to hold us that way, to be seen enough to be able to be aware of our woundedness, to be aware of still how shaped we are by our childhood wounds. And then ironically, that process of being seen heals us. But when I work with a client at any age with any issue, I don't try to fix them. I don't try to make them better. I try to understand them. I try to see them without judgment, with compassion. And the process, the act of seeing somebody, or maybe more accurately, the act of being seen, is the thing that heals us, is the thing that then allows us to move through the emotions, the feelings, the woundedness. Essentially, the ingredients in intimacy are two whole people. And there's no such thing as a whole person, really. I mean, nobody's completely integrated and whole. Those are only ideas that really are more like thought experiments. But if we were to describe intimacy, we would say that the extent to which each individual person in a partnership is whole and integrated, aware of their unconscious, is able to see their dents, is able to see the parts of themselves that have been wounded and dented and bruised, that aren't functioning, and to be aware of that. The ability, in other words, to be a whole person, not a good person, but a whole person. That is the predictor of the capacity for intimacy. So you can only be intimate to the extent that you are whole. And over and over and over again, I see it. You see it. You've experienced it, I'm sure. People in our culture try to fill up that missing part with somebody else. And we mistakenly call that experience an intimacy. I think about this a lot when it comes to the parents at our wilderness program. Oftentimes, when the identified patient is moved out of the system into treatment, that it can expose the fissures, the cracks, the chasms in the marriage. Because when there's an identified patient, this is an idea called triangulation. When there's an identified patient, i.e., the problematic child in a family, the parents can focus their anxiety and their energy on that child, on the identified patient, and they don't have to work out and focus on. It doesn't get exposed. They're kind of their problematic patterns. And so the child isn't necessarily the cause of parental discord or conflict, but it can soothe to temporarily mask it and ultimately expose the issues as the couple goes forward. Parent-child challenges are not the cause of marital issues, but they are a force that exposes invisible fissures at any kind of stress, invisible fissures at the foundation. Money problems, health problems, a child struggling with mental health or addiction can expose the limitations of a couple. I love this idea to illustrate the idea that it takes two whole selves to create an intimate relationship. This is from a book, in part from my book, that Audacity to Be You, but I take the idea from a book called Meeting the Shadow. And it goes something like this. But one day we noticed that our parents didn't like certain parts of us. which this author, Robert Bly, called a ball of light. That they didn't like certain parts of the ball. And to keep our parents' love, we put those parts in a bag. Next, after parents, teachers, and peers have their say, telling us what is unacceptable. Bly describes this process using the imagery of a bag that we drag behind us. We put all of those parts of ourselves in the bag to keep from being alone, to keep from being abandoned. In middle school, high school, and college, the process accelerates, and our stuffing of the bag fills it up larger and larger. And then, and to quote him directly, out of a round globe of energy, the 20-year-old ends up with a slice. We'll imagine a man who has a thin slice left, and we'll imagine that he meets a woman. Let's say they are both 24. She has a thin, elegant slice left. They join each other in a ceremony, and this union of the two slices is called a marriage. Even together, the two slices do not make up one person. And while while many imagine that the fusion of two into one in a romantic sense, it can also be a condition of psychosis, a severe distortion of reality. This is why phrases like crazy about you might be an accurate depiction of the early stages of romantic love. As the relationship grows, fissures are exposed, and later with time and pressure, they become chasms. And if we look closely enough, we will inevitably discover that the early experience of love was flawed at its beginning. This is not a pessimistic view of it. I believe that all the relationships that we have, including our intimate partnerships, are here to teach us about ourselves, to invite us to understand things at a deeper level of consciousness. And if we don't go down deeper, if we don't go back, if we don't understand how we were made, and that the issues, the anger, the rage, the hurt, the isolation, the abandonment that we've experienced in our past, that for many of us was so subtle that it's unremarkable. If we don't dig down and find those roots of those issues that I just described, we will be we will be deceived into thinking that the marriage is the cause, that we've somehow inexplicably married a narcissistic partner who starts to beat us down or can't listen to us or can't see us. But again, with some psychotherapy, with somebody who's capable of assisting you along the process, you can begin to see that those issues, while they do play out in our marriages, predated even our meeting the partner that we are currently with. Differentiation is a term in the literature that describes the balance between connection and individuation. If I am differentiated, I am a separate self, aware of my feelings, wants, and needs to a certain extent, and I am also capable of holding space for you, of being patient, of being compassionate. In the classical sense, we're talking about the difference between the masculine and the feminine. I've been talking a lot about this lately on my social media. And masculine and feminine isn't necessarily correlated to male and female. It's a classical idea that goes back centuries. And each male, each female, each non-binary or any gendered person ideally would have a healthy balance of the masculine and the feminine. But we've lost touch with those ideas in our current culture. The masculine idea is, again, a sense of self, of knowing who you are, what you want, being decisive and clear about yourself. And whereas the feminine characteristic is an ability to hold somebody with compassion, to be patient, to be grounded, to create a sense of security and safety. Those are the two aspects of the psyche, the masculine and the feminine. And so differentiation is like that. The individuation part of us is the masculine part of us, the connected, emotional, compassionate, nurturing side of us is the feminine side of us. Ideally, whether you're a man or a woman or any gender, like I said earlier, you have a balance of both. You have a significant amount of both. What I don't like about pop psychology when they talk about these issues is how they reduce it down to talking about it in a very simple way. For example, there's a lot of pop psychologists and self-help authors that will say the great task in life is to show up courageously and to tell the truth, to speak your truth with courage. They trumpet. And that is part of becoming a whole self. But the other part of it is the listening part. And that part doesn't get a lot of the press. But in an intimate relationship, you need both, ideally. You need to be able to hold your partner's dilemma, issues, dents and bruises with some kind of patience and some kind of compassion and some kind of affection. And you also need to show up and tell the truth. Typically, in couples where there's a betrayal, the one who's really bad at telling the truth for fear that he or she is going to be rejected or abandoned ends up lying, not telling the truth, not expressing, not getting their needs met. So what do? Because they can't conceive of a possible way of getting the needs met in this current relationship with this current person, they sneak out the back door. They go out the side door and they cheat. And when they get found out, of course, they so nicely fit into the role of the identified patient, because nobody would argue against the idea that betraying somebody in an intimate relationship like that is a negative thing, is a bad thing. So everybody agrees that person is the bad object. That person is the problem. That person is the villain in the story. And what that person tries to do often to solve the problem is tries to commit not to do it again. I'm just not going to cheat again. I'm going to stay true to my spouse, and that is that. And while that can work for some, and if it works for you, that's fantastic. But the real antidote to betrayal is to tell the truth and to fight, if you will, within the marriage, to fight with your partner, to assert yourself. And you can complain that the other person is not a safe listener, that they overreact, that if you tell the truth, that they'll become very traumatized or upset, or it'll become very conflictual. But the fact of the matter is that becomes your job to tell the truth. And if you're lucky enough to tell the truth to somebody who can listen, in other words, if you're allowed to be yourself, why would you ever leave or go anywhere else? That's what you're looking for anyway. So the idea is to be able to show up with both parts. And typically one person is better at telling the truth. One person is better at listening. And so they each have to work on the second project. The truth teller, the one who's able to express their feelings, talk about their anxieties, their fears, their frustrations, their upsets. That person's job or focus, project, if you will, is to tell the truth. Excuse me, to listen with compassion and patience. And conversely, if you're a good listener, a good soother, a patient person, a person capable of holding somebody else's woundedness, somebody else's emotions, somebody else's feelings, somebody else's dilemma, if that comes more natural to you, and for a lot of people who grew up with narcissistic parents, which is most of us, or parents with mental illness symptoms, which is all of us, when you're good at holding space for that kind of person, and that comes natural to you, your job is to learn to tell the truth more often. So if you're a good listener, you got to work on telling the truth. If you're a good talker, you got to work on listening. And all the self-help folks out there do such a good job of talking about the truth-telling component, but they don't talk about the listening component. In a lot of ways, this is called healthy detachment. differentiation, this balance between self and connection. But really, that's just an emphasis on what it feels like for a lot of people that are too close, that are too reactive, that are too dependent. It feels like detachment, but it's really attachment. See, in attachment literature, and this goes for parenting, healthy, I'll just say this as slowly as I can. Healthy detachment in attachment psychology, healthy detachment is really the same exact thing as healthy attachment. We don't know that because we were taught that anxious attachment was love, that to worry, to wring your hands at night, that our parents, that they were worried and disappointed and scared for our well-being. We were told that that was love. So that gets modeled. That gets put out there as an example of something we should strive for. We even tell our children when they have mental health symptoms and mental health issues or addiction, we tell them how upset, how scared, how angry, how disappointed, how sad we are. Even if we stay away from some of those words that have shame more closely associated with them, we tell them that our fear and our worry is love. And it's not. Our fear and our worry is our fear and our worry. And love is something safe. Love is actually the opposite of fear and worry. So in all of our culture, you see, we start getting all these ideas that just aren't true. And it's not the fault of the people teaching us to it because they were taught that also. But if you want to take the road less traveled, if you want to embark on the hero's journey, this is what comes of it. This is this experience of understanding how we were built, how we were made, where we were dented, how we were bruised, and how we go about repairing those things without intervention. Right? We get married, we date in our teens, in our 20s, we couple up, and we think we've solved the problem. And none of us have. None of us have. In family systems, systems that support differentiation and allow for differences provide a sense of belonging and well-being. I love this quote from the Eden Project by somebody named Delmore Schwartz. Who among us can ever know ourselves well enough to be capable of agape, an expression of what we might oxymoronically call disinterested love? That is, love wholly invested in the well-being of the other, without the shadow of self-interest cruising beneath the surface like a shark. We are taught that to be selfless. We are taught that our parents were selfless, that they only acted in our best interest. It's not possible, and therefore it's not true. But again, when we get told, as we all do, that parts of us or parts of people are the good and acceptable parts, what are we left to do with the other parts of us? We're left to deny them, to repress them, to ignore them. And what happens when we deny, repress, and ignore the parts of ourselves that we were told were not the right or the good way or the acceptable way to be? They come up later and bite us. That's what happens in betrayal. That's what happens in the dynamics that lead up to an overt, specific betrayal, or just the betrayal that happens in a lot of marriages, even without the sexual acting out. Let's talk about intimacy a little bit. I think this is something I hear from couples all the time. Often, doesn't have to be this way. It can be same-sex couples. It can be different genders, but a very common kind of path for understanding this looks like the wives of the clients that I work with saying, I want to hear what my husband thinks and feels. I want to know about his inner world. And the husband's experience, of course, at a very visceral level is no way. That doesn't work. Every time I tell people what I feel and think, I get punished for it. I've been punished my whole life. When I told my parents that I was angry, they told me I was wrong. They made me the problem. When I told my teachers, the other authority, my whole life. And in this example, if we're talking about the wife again, just going back to that particular stereotype, what she wants when she says she wants to know what her husband feels, she wants a sense of feeling close to him, of feeling connected to him. But what she doesn't know is that a lot of what he's feeling is hurt and anger and resentment. There's also love and warmth and respect and nurturing and affection in there. All of that's in there too. But the part that's hard to express is the anger and the hurt and the rage. So if he makes the choice to accept the invitation to share his feelings and tells his wife, and she doesn't have an adequate ego development, she's going to make him the problem and they'll just end up in an argument. Conversely, if she does have enough ego development, her response to her husband's anger would be, I'm so glad you're telling me that. She might be silent because it's hard to listen to somebody be angry at you. It's hard to listen to somebody tell you how you've hurt them. You want to describe how they've misinterpreted things, how all the facts aren't right, how maybe they haven't used I feel statement language. One of my favorite ways to fight with my wife is to point out her communication skill errors when she's telling me something I don't want to hear. I hide behind my knowledge and my education of the skills because I don't want to deal with the fact that I feel insecure or threatened by what she has to say. Intimacy isn't always warm and fuzzy. Intimacy is terrifying. Intimacy will expose your childhood wounds. If your partner, male or female or otherwise, tells you how they feel sincerely, if that is their practice, and you're capable of listening to them somewhat, that what I'm saying is true. It is unpleasant. It is terrifying. When you're on the receiving end of somebody telling their honest truth, you're often going to the resulting feeling is you're going to feel distant. You're going to want to retreat to kind of tend to your wounds. The person that's sharing will feel alive, energized. They might even feel affectionate and sexual towards you because they've gotten it out of themselves. But you on the receiving end, it's a horrible experience. Then the person who's just done the talking, the expressing, who feels alive and affectionate and drawn toward them, feels that abandonment, that distance, that coldness, and feels threatened by it. And they try to get the partner back instead of understanding that that's a natural part of the process. Intimacy requires the capacity to contain or hold somebody. I had somebody years ago explain in a dynamic with their spouse. If my wife, he said, was being reasonable, I would be happy to contain her. But she's not being reasonable. She's being entitled or spoiled. And I explained to the husband in this one case and the many times since and before, I explained, if your wife was being reasonable, it wouldn't be containing. It would just be easy. See, my work as a husband, as a partner, is to be in love with my wife and her dilemma enough that I can hold it, even when it comes out and spills out on me. And if I have a childhood wound that's unresolved and unhealed because I had a mother who was depressed and anxious, which I did, by the way, if that reminds me or triggers or is an echo of me holding space for my mother, I can become very reactive, very dysregulated, very upset, very defensive. Intimacy doesn't feel good at first, but over the long and in the moment, but over the long haul, it is the project, the act of two people, two more whole people being present with each other, honoring the other and allowing for differences. As James Hollis says, it is to open the door to freeing self and other to be who each other is meant to be. It is to open both the possibility of something called love. Again, I can't overstate this enough to you folks. The idea of intimacy, of love, of deep and conscious companionship, we have to get rid of good and bad. That's the lens shift in psychology, ironically. We think that the morality is out there in the religions and in the schools. But the deepest morality only comes after right and wrong are gotten rid of. And that opens itself up to compassion, to charity, which is an undeserved love, an unearned kind of love. You have to learn to own your own stuff, your own fears and anxiety. See, the beginning place for building intimacy when it's been exposed, when the problems have been exposed, either by betrayal or by just the relationship dying. The beginning point is that each partner has to realize that they have their own dents and bruises. This is something I've learned too, which is the solution to marital problems, even after a betrayal, are not divorce, and it's not staying together. If you go to a marriage therapist and they make it the goal for them to figure out if it's a partnership worth saving or staying in, you're with the wrong therapist. The goal is for each person to own their project and to know what it is, which gives the couple a chance. If partner A is committed to owning their stuff, doesn't guarantee that partner 2 or partner B is going to be the right one. But you have the same work either way. And the divorce or the staying together is not the solution, but it comes out of the solution of realizing and doing your work. You have to learn how to feel and be present in the relationship. You have to learn to resist the control. It gets born out of your fear. The terrifying nature of romance and intimacy, because it risks everything. It risks rejection, shame, and being alone. And it is symbolically manifested in good sex. I remember when I was in college, we were studying dream analysis, and the professor had said at one point, after somebody was talking about sex in a dream, he explained that in your dreams, sex isn't about sex, which is, I think, a relief for most of us, because there's some things that happen in our dreams that don't make a lot of sense. So he explained that sex in your dreams isn't about sex. And I raised my hand, being a therapist in training, and I said, it's my experience that sex is never about sex. Sex is about intimacy. It's the physical manifestation. And really good sex is when power and control are relinquished, and when two people show up frightened and scared and vulnerable and capable of holding the other. You've probably heard the phrase or the idea that rape is not about sex. And in a sense, that's true. In a sense, that's not true. Rape is just the worst kind of sex possible in the human existence, because it's about power and control and force. If you think of it, it's on the continuum with good sex. Good sex is about surrender and vulnerability and holding and containing and compassion and honesty, right? And the opposite is power and control, which is rape or molestation or sexual assault. That's the bad sex. To the extent where power and control, even to keep yourself safe, are in play, intimacy is not possible. I talked about this in the Audacity to Be pretty clearly, and I want to just share this idea of loving and needing. It is critical that we learn to distinguish between loving and needing. And I think we confuse or conflate the two very, very often. Many think of needing as a deeper and higher form of love. But in fact, it's the opposite. Loving is a giving thing, as in, how can I help you? How can I support you? And needing is a taking thing, as in, can you do this for me? Now, why do we struggle so much with needing? Why are we ashamed to need? Gosh, it's so simple, but so profound. We're ashamed of needing because when we needed things from our parents that they weren't able to get, they made us feel bad for the needing because they didn't want to own their own inadequacy. I'm going to say that again. The reason that we have learned to be ashamed of needing as women and men is because when we needed things from our parents that for whatever reason they were incapable of giving us, they made us feel bad for the needing so they didn't have to own their lack of capacity. They didn't have to own their limitedness. So they took the bad feeling in them that they were not willing to feel and they put it onto us. Tried to erase our neediness so they didn't have to deal with inadequacy. And then we grew up as children, not thinking our parents are limited and not thinking our parents are incapable of loving or meeting our needs. We grew up thinking we are bad and learning that needing is a bad thing. And then those things get replicated in our marriage. When I can't be there for my wife, the risk, the temptation for her and for me is to make me a bad husband. Not a human husband, but a bad husband. Or conversely, when my wife asks for something that I need, I'm tempted to use names like, you're being too needy. Can't you see how drained I am? Why would you even ask to talk to me late at night like this? Do you see how it gets replicated? I do to her what I know her parents did to her, what my parents did to me, what most of our parents did to us, what you've done to your children. I punish and shame the thing that triggers the thing I don't want to deal with. It's okay to love and to need someone, but we must be able to see the difference between the two. If we do not see it and acknowledge it, a few things will occur. Feelings of resentment and abandonment will occur, and the projection of our inadequacies, like I was just describing, will happen. We'll project those onto the other. Another thing I want to talk about before I go on to the next quote, next idea. I said it a little bit earlier, but I'm going to focus it on during this slide. In difficult or intimate or important, emotionally weighty conversations with your partner, the talker is the taker and the listener is the giver. That's why I'm not so fond of the self-help work out there that trumpets telling the truth is the greatest thing, because it's important. It's actually part of my project as a man, growing up as a boy with a mother who was depressed and anxious. I have a difficult time taking care of my needs, telling the truth, asking for things, right? That's why I became a therapist, so that I could do for a career what I did growing up, which is take care of and hold space for other people. A lot of therapists, though, don't know what therapy is, and so they just come in with the idea of fixing and manipulating clients into getting better. That's a whole nother webinar, a whole nother broadcast. But listening is giving and talking is taking in general. And so you got to slow it down. If you don't slow it down, you're going to have the same argument, the same discussion that's at a superficial level of consciousness over and over and over again. But when you start to drill down, to dig down into what we're talking about here on this broadcast, you start to see what's happening. And you start to realize the reason I'm feeling distant and uncomfortable and like I want to pull away is because I'm being drained of energy, of life. I don't mean like in a life or death thing, just being drained of the energy that is love. It's why I have to be very conscious when my wife says, "Can you listen?" I have to be very conscious of whether or not I have it in my belly to listen. See, love means Technically, love is an excess. It's something that I give, not for something in return, not for love and gratitude in return. It's extra. I can give it. So in my discussions with my wife and vice versa, we have to be very conscious about when we're asking for something, when we're needing something, when we have the capacity or not to give. More from the Eden Project by James Hollis. So he explains, to be fascinated by the other is to be possessed by an affected idea. This is what happens in projection. In the most rabid stages of being in love, and rabid is by no means too strong of a word, one is unable to do other than obsess on the other. One is caught in a projective identification with the heart's desires. The boundaries between self and other dissolve again, as they did for the infant. Accepting the journey obliges one to accept fear and to let go of our chief fantasies. In other words, when we experience that rabid phase of falling in love, we feel completed. That's why we said, I explained earlier, we're not hungry and we don't even need to sleep. That's how intoxicating that experience of having one's needs temporarily fulfilled is. And while fulfilling each other's needs in this way, right? Filling the holes, the empty parts, making up for lost parts and wounded parts is exhilarating in the initial phases. It can become exhausting as the relationship matures. And eventually what happens is the one that's been the holder, the container, the safe place ends up saying, my needs matter too. And what he or she does to justify the affair or betrayal is say, screw you, my needs are important. And they go about getting their needs met in unethical ways outside of their integrity. And what they have to do to be able to rationalize and justify that is turn the partner into a monster, to the bad mother, to the bad father, to the insensitive, the uncaring, the selfish, the self-interested one, you see. But like I said, if we take responsibility for our own healing, our own woundedness, we're not capable of projecting that onto somebody else. A few years ago, a therapist at Evoke shared with me a quote from Will Smith. And in my defense, this was shared to me long before his recent memoir and even he and Jada's public disclosure of the affair that she had came out. So it was before that. And this is what Will Smith said on a video my friend sent to me a few years ago. He said, whether or not a person is happy is utterly out of your control. We came into this false, he's talking about he and his wife, and I think it's true for most of us. We came into this false romantic concept that somehow when we got married, we would become one. And what we realized is that we were two completely separate people on two completely separate individual journeys, and that we were choosing to walk our separate journeys together. But her happiness was her responsibility, and my happiness was my responsibility. We decided that we were going to find our own individual, internal, private, separate joy, and then we were going to present ourselves to the relationship and to each other already happy. You're not responsible for your partner's happiness. They are. But I think more important than that, they're not responsible for your happiness. You are. And the question that gets begged when I say this is, should you leave them? Should they leave you? And the answer, of course, is nobody in the world can answer that except for you. And if you find a therapist who will answer the question, find a new therapist. It's actually a breach of their ethical obligations. That being said, this is the job of becoming a self. You get to decide what is enough or not. Are you a doormat? Are you too rigid and spoiled in your expectations and your needs? Only you can answer that. Only you can answer that. And that's what Will and Jada figured out. When we do our work, we change the frame from turning the other into something bad to seeing the other as simply a human being. In other words, the more work that we do, my wife is not a needy or an abusive or an incapable bad person. She's just a human being with faults and flaws, and I get to decide how to interact with that, or even if I want to interact with that. And searching for a magical other to cure us and fill our holes will lead to the kind of dilemmas, the kind of situations that lead to betrayal. If the person chooses who's the dishonest one, if the person chooses not to fight, not to walk in the front door and deal with the problem, not to own their own feelings, they'll be tempted, and if they commit the act, they'll sneak out the back door to get their needs met. So what do? You learn to take care of yourself. And if you're lucky, you have a partner that learns that it's their job to take care of themselves. You can't be each other's everything. It's impossible. It's not what it's meant to be. For me, I have to have a therapist. My wife can't possibly hold everything all the time. Some people get sponsors and mentors, and others, good friends who are going to sit and listen and hold space for you. You learn in this process not to make others responsible for your own happiness. And by the way, this isn't a parenting broadcast, which most of mine are, but that's true of our children. They're not responsible for making us happy. I love a quote I read recently where it said that children that grow up believing that it's their job to make their parents happy and proud, in other words, parent pleasing children, grow up to be people pleasing adults. And eventually, if they get married and have children, they end up believing it's their job to please and make their partner happy and to please and make their children happy. And that was never the case. That's the generational trauma that our parents passed down to us, is that we're responsible to make other people happy and that other people are responsible to make us happy. Learning to understand yourself, embrace your dents and your wounds, your holes, your limitations. Learning to allow for differences, learning to fall in love with your partner's dilemma, and avoid shaming, manipulation, and violence as a way to get your needs met. Hollis says that violence is the language of the inarticulate. The father wound, the father gift. Since I'm talking about masculine and feminine and how this fits into our marriages, the father gift, or the masculine gift, more accurately, is a sense of self and identity. The masculine parent, the parent that has an adequate masculine self, allows the child to explore, to take risks, to experiment, to fail and succeed. And they provide a safe enough container for the child to do that in somewhat a safe way. The excess of that is abandonment. So the father gift or the masculine gift is independence and autonomy and a sense of self and awareness, identity. And if it's taken too far, it's abandonment. And the child who experiences the abandonment ends up feeling not worthwhile, uninteresting. Then they spend their life trying to prove to the world how interesting and good and amazing and worthwhile they are. Now the mother wound and the mother gift. The mother gift is safety, home, connection, nurturing, empathy, warmth, love, relationship, a safe holding, if you will. Even our anatomy shows this, right? For the feminine body, it's about receiving. It's about holding. That's the mother gift or the feminine gift, which men and women can do if they're developed. the feminine wound or toxic femininity, right, is engulfment, swallowing, right? No separate self. Everybody has to feel and think and do and believe the same thing. And the child ends up feeling unimportant, lost, ends up getting in relationships where their needs don't matter because they have no self, because it's been swallowed up by the feminine. From Joseph Campbell, out of the book, The Eden Project. I think one of the problems in marriage is that people don't realize what it is. They think it's a long love affair, and it isn't. Marriage has nothing to do with being happy. It has to do with being transformed. And when the transformation is realized, it is a magnificent experience. But you have to submit. You have to yield. You have to give. You can't just dictate. And Hollis went on to say transformation is about enlargement, and enlargement generally comes out of suffering. I talk about how betrayal occurs, and I've kind of said it all throughout, but let me take you through a quick little set of steps. Person one in a partnership, there's a hole, a wound, unfinished business, anxiety, a lack of safety. Person one finds someone who fills that hole. It makes person one feel good, feel soothed, feel complete, feel safe. That feeling is reflected back onto the other person. You are good for making me feel better, or I love you. Person two internalizes that as you have healed my wound. You have given me the feeling that I've been seeking, the feeling that I am enough, or I love you too. Person two is then unwilling or unable to continue being responsible for person one's well-being. You can't carry somebody forever. They fall short. They don't have enough energy. Person one accuses person two of being a bad partner, and they fall out of love. To get out, each must take responsibility for their own happiness. They must come to the marriage happy, so when they show up, they can support the other from a position of abundance rather than from need. My favorite quote: "A coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It is the prerogative of the brave. Projection, fusion, going home is easy. Loving another's otherness is heroic. If we really love other, we have heroically taken on the responsibility for our own individuation, our own journey. And this heroism may properly be called love." Mahatma Gandhi. This is true of couples and also of parents. If divorce is the option that you choose, your life will be different. Some things might be better and some things might be worse. It'll be different. Just as if you change jobs today. And the primary question isn't, should you get married? Should you stay married? Should you get divorced? The question, like it is in parenting, is who are you? Who is the other person? How do you fit together? What's your work? And out of those questions and the answers that come will arise the decision is whether or not to get married, stay married, or get divorced. But divorce or marriage doesn't solve anything. Not really. Not fundamentally. You'll find yourself, unless you do your work, in similar patterns in similar relationships. And when people come to me with the question about divorce or marriage, my response is the work is the same either way. It's kind of like playing a video game. Imagine playing a video game where you get good at level number 1 and level number 2 you're still good at. Level number 3, you kind of have to pay attention because it's getting a little harder. Level number 4, it's pretty hard. Level number 5 is really hard. Level number 6, you can barely make it through. And level number 7, you can't make it. You're not there yet. You don't have the skills. We've all played video games, and I hope you know what I'm talking about using that analogy. But what if I told you when you got to level 5 or 6, just press reset? Just restart the game. You would say to me, well, that's boring. And I'd say, yeah, but you're going to be successful. You're going to win. And you would say to me, but I want to pass level 7. Doing level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 again doesn't help. Level 7 is where it's at. So you can get married and divorced 100 times. And until you do the work, nothing is solved. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is necessarily addressed. And you get to decide. And the decision comes from being who you are, being a self. You have 2 projects in a relationship, in an intimate relationship: telling the truth and being who you are, and holding or containing the other person with love and kindness. Are you better at one than the other? Most of us are. In fact, most often, men are better at holding with love and kindness. Ironically, you might not think that, but they listen more. At least in the couples therapy sessions and the couples intensives that I do. And the wife is usually a better truth teller. And in many cases, not all, it's the husband that's committed the betrayal. So he has to learn to tell the truth in the relationship. And if he wants a new partner, get a divorce and go get a new partner. Do it with integrity. But tell the truth. Fight with your partner. And in this scenario that I've just described with the husband, then the wife or the other partner has to learn to listen. Not because it's comfortable, not because it feels warm and fuzzy, but it's because that's the nature of intimacy. Intimacy is uncomfortable and terrifying until we become accustomed to it. And that takes decades. We like to make the other person the bad object instead of realizing that the problems and the solutions are inside of us. In considering divorce, if one looks close enough, one can see how the problems were there in the beginning. And in many ways, they are the reason that you fell in love in the first place. Growing up will expose the emotional immaturity of the other and reveal the fractures that were present from the beginning. What are the take-home messages? Be responsible for yourself and learn to take care of yourself. Do your work. If you can't love and be kind to your partner, then you have work to do, which might ultimately end up in you not staying married. Understand your own madness. I know this is not a parenting broadcast, but it's the same with parenting. The hero, like Gandhi said, takes responsibility for their own differentiation and their own journey. And this heroism, he says, may properly be called love. Own your stuff, your dents, your pathology, your woundedness, your limitations, your insecurities, your fears. If these things go unowned, we will project them onto our partners, and maybe even more sadly, we will project them onto our children and make them the problem. And the shift from being good to being a person. There's no way to be good. It just doesn't exist. But we have a shot at being more and more whole. And as love matures, you'll kind of go through this process. Tonight's broadcast is really about mature love. Understand what your project is and make that your focus. You can't blame your partner who doesn't listen well for the affair. You can say how it hurt you and how it didn't feel safe, but the way you chose to deal with it is your choice. That sideways, dishonest way, that's your choice. And focusing on the fact that he or she can't listen isn't really the solution anyway. You just have to learn to tell the truth regardless. Similarly, blaming your partner because they can't be honest in a relationship So much betrayal work that I've heard is about beating up the offender because he can't tell the truth. Well, guess what? That's because of his childhood wound. So you can't force him to tell the truth or call him on it or expect perfection or beat him up or hold him to this precise standard. All you can do is work on being safe. Understand what your project is. And like I said, ultimately, it's our job to enjoy our spouse and to fall in love with their dilemma. I think that's what mature love is the ability to love your partner's dilemma. Learn the difference between taking and listening. Excuse me. I'll say that again correctly. Learn the difference between talking and listening and giving and taking and loving and needing. And divorce is always an option. If it's not an option, then love doesn't exist, then it's not a choice. When couples tell me divorce is not an option, I say that's ridiculous. It must be an option. Because if you're presented a choice where there's only one option, there's no choice. It must be an option. And if you choose it, your life will be different and nothing will get fixed. Not in the big picture, not inherently, unless you do your work. All right, I'm going to wait for any live questions on our Q&A that comes later. So thanks for joining me. I'll just go through a few announcements. My books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are on Amazon and Audible. I read The Audacity to Be You, where I do talk about this quite a bit. We have support groups online right now for wilderness current families and alumni. December 30th is our next wilderness parent support group. We also have once a month, we have an alumni only meeting. So for those of you that are a little farther along, this January 25th is our next one because we just did one tonight. In fact, it ran concurrently with this one. And if you are an intensives alumni, January 11th, go to Malia or just email malia@evoketherapy.com for more information to learn about our support groups. If you want to do a deep dive, everything I've talked about today comes out and is revealed in our intensive work. Finding You is our kind of our flagship. So if you want to do a deep dive into your own work, the next opportunity is January 12th through 16th. We also have online offerings. January 28th through 30th is an online offering. So if you want to save time or money, online is an excellent option. Intensives at Evoke Therapy is a place to email to get more information. If you want to do coaching with an attachment-informed therapist or coach, contact coaching@evoketherapy.com. We have pursuits trips for families and young adults, anywhere from 3 to 30 days with our staff. Think therapy light, recalibrating, kind of reconnecting to your work. Sober fun. We ask all current family members to go to 6, I always say it wrong, 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or adultchildren.org. You can also go to refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org to get free resources and classes in your local community. You can get all of these broadcasts on your favorite podcast app. Just go to your favorite podcast app and search Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast, or you can go to soundcloud.com and you can listen on your computer. You can find Evoke and me, Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles either @Evoke Therapy or @Dr. Brad Reedy. And Evoke Intensives, you can also find on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching either Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And then, of course, our blog has new content each week. My next broadcast will be a Q&A, so anything left over, if you want to digest this, think about it, listen to it again. On the 30th of this week, which is Thursday night. Yep, Thursday night at 6:30 p.m., I'll have an open forum, a Q&A for Evoke Family and Friends. You're welcome to bring any questions about anything that we do to that format. And then I'm also going to be doing a book review of the book What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. So I'm looking forward to that. I hope this was helpful. I know there were a lot of complex ideas. I hope it gave you some clarity or a new perspective or our new idea. And I just want to thank you for on behalf of the people that love you. Thank you for being willing to do your work. Remember, as Ram Dass says, the only thing you can do for those that you love is work on yourself. Have a great evening, folks, and I'll talk to you in 48 hours. Bye-bye.